Enable features in that app. Yes. All right. Unattaching keyboard without making it rotate is apparently pretty hard. Okay. Getting back into things. So, chapter 8. We started talking about this already when we talked about, what is it that, grows economies, right? Why is it that some economies have higher standards of living than other standards of living than other economies, right? How come some people enjoy more consumption of goods and services, or how come the consumption of goods and services increases over time? Well, to explain that, really, we need to explain the trends in the labor markets, right? So, we were told that, not just productivity, not just technology, but productivity is one of those keys to growth, right? And so we're going to discuss, what is labor productivity? How has it changed over time? And how, where do wages come into play? So the first thing is to kind of give us a background. There's 5 trends in labor markets for the past few decades. So this is for industrialized countries, and we're talking only about, the past from actually we're talking like 1950. All right, so the first trend. These industrialized countries have enjoyed real wage growth. So remember, when we talk about real, we're talking about the purchasing power. We're accounting for inflation, right? In the 20th century. So just as a snapshot, in 2016, the U.S. real earnings were 2 times those in 1960 and more than 5 times those in 1929. So part of this is, technology, right? Part of it is factories, part of it is management, the Henry Ford model of assembly line kind of production, right? It increased the productivity, which also translated into increase in real earnings. Our second trend in labor markets. The real wage has stagnated since 1973. So, during the 1960s, the 1970s, it was, very fast growth. It was 2.5% per year. Compared to, 1973 to 95 was 0.9%. Again, it's per year. Then we had a small period, 96 to 2007, where productivity, real wage gains increased by a bit more than 1%, right? That had to do with computers, had to do with cell phone technology, right? All that information communication technology we talked about. Then those productivity gains kind of, were all juiced to the max, and we had a recession that was contagious, right? The housing recession that was contagious to the rest of the financial market. So it ended up causing a lot of job losses and a lot of, companies going under. And so our real wage gains were only 0.7% during that period. And so looking at the whole period here, the 1970 to 2012, there's only a 1.1% per year that we see in the last, 40 years compared to this, 2.5%, right, that we had. So was this just a fluke, right? How do we get back there? The same thing here. Was this just a fluke? How do we get back there? There's a lot of discussion about that within economics. Third trend. The inequality between wages, so wage inequality, the difference between what people are getting, has increased in the US. So in this period between 1970 and 2016, the workers at the low end of the spectrum, right? So, your custodians and stuff like that, right? The low skilled, the low end, so we shouldn't say low end workers, that's mean. Low end of the income distribution. They actually had a decrease in the real wage from 25% to 30%. And in this same period, what happened? The best educated, skilled workers, they had a significant increase in their real wages. And that's a part of why we're all here, right? It's why we're in college, right? Is to get this advanced college degree, to learn some skills and things like that, right? Because, the studies show, right, the evidence is very clear that, income with an advanced college degree is 3 times higher than the income of a high school graduate. And 4 times higher of somebody, who did not graduate from high school. And then obviously, going to grad school just increases that even more. Trend number 4. Trend number 4, the number of people with jobs has grown in the past 50 years. So, up until recently, the rate of job growth was quite high. From 1980 to 2000, the number of jobs grew by 36%, but the number of people grew only by 25%. So back in 1970, only 57% of the population 16 plus had jobs. That went up to 64% in 2000, back down to 60% in 2017, but still higher than that 57%. Trend number 5. Western Europe has suffered higher unemployment than what we've seen in the USA. So, unemployment in France from 1990 to 2001 was 10.9%, whereas it was only 5.5% in the US. Just a snapshot here, 2017, we've got 4.4% in the US and 9.8% in France. So we'll talk about this in a bit. There are similar issues in many other Western European countries. So, again, we're going to kind of be going over these trends and discussing them with an economic model. Well, what is that economic model we're going to be using? It's a supply and demand model of the labor market. So now instead of having prices on the y-axis, right, what are we going to have? We're going to have something that's still denominated in dollars, right? We're going to have your wages, or maybe, if we're talking about a yearly thing, right, it might be salary. And of course, because we stripped inflation out of this, right, we're talking about real wages. We don't want to talk about two moving parts, right? We'd rather just talk about what's happening with the actual wages, not what's happening with wages and with the movement of the price level. And then in the quantity here, so we're not talking about quantity of goods, right? We're talking about the number of people employed. So this is the this is the size of the labor force, right? The number employed. Well, not the size of the labor force, sorry. Size of the employed part of the labor force. And so this is going to be in number of workers, right? So again, I said number of employer. There's another way that this is sometimes done, but we're not going to do it. But I'm just going to mention it here, but we're not going to use it. Is you could look at it in terms of worker hours. So we don't use this here. But why is there this alternative of using worker hours? What is one of the drawbacks of just using whole number of people rather than worker hours? Does everybody in every job work the same number of hours? No, right? Some people are working part-time, some people are working overtime, right? And so using worker hours allows for a more granular, estimation. But for our purposes here, using number of people employed, we just assume everybody works 40 hours a week, right? So just to simplify stuff, we are not going to talk about worker hours. We're just going to talk about the number of people that are employed. And so this is a very interesting situation because now we have, like, we're used to interacting with the supply and demand model by being on the demand side, right? We're consumers that demand products. Well, now we're on the supply side, right? Because the labor market is an input market. So firms buy labor from you, right? From us, from the reader, to produce goods and services. And again, since we're talking about macro, we're looking at, aggregate levels. So this is the number of people employed, in the USA. This is, the average real wage in the USA. If we were to think about a microeconomic labor market analysis, right, that would be more, looking at a particular category of workers or looking at a particular phenomenon, like what we're going to talk about in a little bit, labor mobility. So there's a demand for laborers that is being expressed by the firms, right? So these firms here, they have a demand for labor. And this demand for labor has diminishing returns to it. So it's going to be curved like this. And so just as before, the lower the price, the more we consume, the lower the wage, the more workers are employed, holding everything else constant, right? We're holding the price of that final good or service constant. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do an example to really illustrate the diminishing returns to labor that we have. So we have the example here of banana computers. And so they can sell all of their computers at $3,000 each. And they figure out, they know their schedule. They know that, if they have so many workers, they can make so many computers per year. How many workers should they actually be demanding? So we're given this schedule. We're told, well, with one worker, they can make 25 computers a year. With two workers, they can make 48 computers per year. With three workers, they can make 69 computers per year. With four workers, they can make 88 computers per year. So I don't know if you guys can see this, but what's happening to the production as we add workers? It's still increasing, right? When we went from 0 to 1, it increased by what, 25? When we went from 1 to 2, it increased by 23, right? This right here is an increase of 23. When we went from 48 to 69, that's an increase of what, 21. Went from 69 to 88, that's an increase of 19. And so these things that I'm calculating here, these are what's called the marginal product. So this is how much extra is going to be produced when I hire one more person. So the marginal product of hiring that second worker is 23 computers. The marginal product of hiring that third worker is 21 computers. The marginal product of hiring that fourth worker is 19 computers. So what's happening to this? It's going down, right? It's decreasing over time, right? So the reason why is because there's a phenomenon happening here, right? The diminishing marginal returns to labor. So just like with capital, right? It's, this is the flip side of increasing opportunity costs. So we assume that all the non-labor market outputs or inputs, all the non-labor inputs are constant, fixed, unchangeable, right? So under this assumption, adding one more worker is still going to increase output, but it increases output by less than the previous additional worker did. So again, we have that example of, you got the pizza shop. It's the size of this room, right? I split half of it into the back of it, and I put an oven in there, and then the other half is all, tables and waiters and stuff like that, right? And at first I only have one waiter, and then or waitress, and then I hire a second one, and then I hire a third one, and then I hire a fourth one, right? And they're able to do more, but at a certain point, they're starting to, the kitchen's getting backed up because there's only one oven, right? Or people are having to wait outside because there's a limited size of the establishment that I've purchased, right? So these other non-labor inputs constrain the rate at which adding labor increases your total output. So the rate at which your total output increases decreases as you continue to add more and more laborers. So you're just, think about it as you're just kind of, everybody's getting more crowded and the other resources are getting more heavily used, so there's more bottlenecks. If you want to think about it like a supply chain kind of thing, right? There's just greater bottlenecks when you increase laborers and don't increase, your capital, the amount of space, so on and so forth. So when we're thinking about how many workers to hire, right? We need more information than just the marginal product, right? We need something called the value of the marginal product, right? So what is the value of the marginal product? So this is the extra revenue that an added worker generates. And so simply all you do is you take the marginal product and you multiply it by the price. So, you know, this one, 25, the first one, the marginal product is 25. 25 times 3,000 gives us a value of marginal product of what? 75,000. So this is telling us for every, so as we go from one worker to two workers, that second worker is going to provide how much extra revenue? $69,000 of extra revenue. When we add that third worker, they're going to provide how much extra revenue? $63,000, because that's my value of the marginal product of that third worker. So this extends down to the point where, you know, we're talking 7 and the total computers are 133. 8 total computers are 144. So this difference is only 11. 11 times 3,000 is $33,000, right? So the value of the marginal product of that 8th worker is $33,000. So what does that mean? That means that, you know, I'm not going to hire an 8th worker for more than $33,000 because they're only going to bring in $33,000. So this value of marginal product, right? This is the demand curve. This is this situation right here, where if we have 3, and if the wage, if we have 3, I'm doing this backwards. So let's slow down. So our rule here only hire an extra worker if the value of the marginal product is greater than the wage paid. So let's say, you know, that the wage is $60K. Well, at $60K, so this is the value of the marginal product, right? And so if we want, we can add an extra little column over here and erase all this stuff. because we're going to be comparing the value of the marginal product by what? The wage. So the wage, we're told that the wage is 50K. Or sorry, 60K. So at 60K, would it make sense for us to hire that first worker? Yes, right? Value marginal product of labor is 75,000, which is greater than 60,000. So yes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to hire that first worker. Now, what about the second worker? Yes, absolutely, right? Because 69,000 is greater than 60,000, we're going to go ahead and we're going to hire that second worker. What about that third worker? Well, 63,000, getting closer, but still higher than 60,000. So I'm going to hire that third worker. What about the fourth worker? It's less than 60,000. I will not hire that fourth worker. So this is where I stop. I hire 3 workers there. Let's go ahead and put a little bit more data on this. If we have 5, then we get 105 computers a year, and the difference between that is 17. 17 times 3,000 is $51,000. And since we're so close, we might as well just get that 6 in there too, because the question asks it. So at 6, we have 120, which is a marginal product of 15, which is a value of marginal product of $45,000. So then, sometimes we'll be asked, okay, well, now the wage is 50K. Right? So we know that if the wage is 60K, that the firm is going to hire 3 workers, because we looked at the value of the marginal product. Now let's go ahead and look at it and compare it to 50K. So again, we can do that same kind of situation here, right? Where we just take a look at each one and we say, is it greater than or less than the wage? But now instead of 60K, it's 50K. So now when we get to that fourth worker, we're going to go ahead and we're going to hire them, right? Because they're cheaper. They can make us $57,000 and we only have to pay them $50,000. What about that fifth worker? We're going to hire the fifth worker. Yes, because 51,000 is greater than 50,000. So we'll hire that fifth worker. But then that sixth worker, right? 50,000 is greater than this 45,000 here. So we're going to stop there. We'll stop at the 5 workers. So when we think about, at $50,000, that's going to be 5 workers. And so this is where we can kind of, simplify and draw that demand curve. If we have our wages in thousands and we've got employment over here, and if we're just looking at the BCC computer employment, right, then their labor demand we've got a couple of points here, right? We've got 60 at 60,000. They demand 3. And we've got another point that at 50,000, they demand 5. So that's our labor demand curve. So just like with regular demand, the lower the wage, the more, so the lower the price, the more we want. The lower the wage, the more employed. So just like with regular demand and supply, right? We've got some shifters. So we've got two things that will shift your labor demand. So the first one is the price of the company's output, right? Usually, it's the result of an increase in the market demand, usually. The other thing is the productivity of your workers. So let's say, we talked about how those non-labor inputs were held fixed, right? Well, what if we have a increase in the quantity and quality of those non-labor inputs? That's going to increase the productivity of the worker. If there's some sort of organizational change, and then obviously if you send your workers or you have an internal training and education, that's supposed to say education. I don't know why there's an extra E in there. So these are all very obvious, right? If the price of it increases, then the labor demand is going to increase. If the productivity increases, then the labor demand is going to increase. And the real reason behind the productivity one, right, is the fact that, you're assuming no change in wages. Eventually, there is a catch-up in wages, right? As productivity increases, then the real wages should follow, but doesn't always happen. All right, so we know it's a supply-demand model, right? We've only got half of it defined, so we need to talk about labor supply. And in order to talk about labor supply, we've got to talk about reservation wages. Reservation wages, those are the lowest wages would accept for a given job. So the reservation wage, that's the opportunity cost of your leisure. Right? Work compensates you for that lost leisure. So the book talks about how, you have this plan to go to the beach, but your neighbor wants you to rake his yard or something like that, right? And so, what are you going to do? Well, unless you're, like the best neighbor in the world, right? You're going to go to the beach unless, you have some more information. So the more information is going to be, well, how much is the neighbor willing to pay me, right? Is he willing to pay me $10, $20, right? What if the neighbor got a whole bunch of money and he's willing to pay you $500? Well, you're not going to go to the beach and you're gonna stay and clean the yard for $500, right? So somewhere in between the $10 and the $500 is your individual reservation wage for how much it would cost to convince you to, spend a day cleaning up the leaves instead of going to the beach. So essentially, our labor supply is a upward sloping curve Why is it sloping up? Because at higher wages, more people come out of the woodwork to work, right? More people are willing to work. So just like with demand, we can have shifts in the labor supply. So this is, primarily from increases in the 16 plus working age population. So, we saw this with the baby boomers. We saw it a bit with immigration. And the other thing is a higher age of retirement. So, you got to think about it. The less people retiring, the less jobs there are for other people. Less people retiring, the greater the labor supply. And then the other thing is increase in the share of working age people to work. And so this, the big thing is in the last 50 years, the female labor force participation rate has increased dramatically, which has shifted the supply out. So the first trend, we'll have a chance to define and talk about the first trend, and then we'll call it a day. So the first trend, if you recall from the beginning of class, was increasing real wages over time. So how do we explain this with our model? Well, industrialized countries have had sustained productivity growth and as a result, there's been an increase in the demand for labor, so a shift rightwards in the labor demand curve. So if we do this graphically, so as a result, we had an increase in employment and an increase in the real wage. Now, what was the cause of this sustained productivity growth? Technological progress. and increases in capital. Right? Remember, we need factories, we need, buildings, all this other kind of stuff in order to make things. We need places for people to go, we need computers for people to work on, right? So increases in the capital, increases in technology are all the reasons why we had the productivity growth, which is why there's the shift outwards in the demand, the sustained real wage increases, and the sustained increase in the employment. All right, we'll pick up here on Friday talking about trend 2 and explain that with our labor market supply and demand equations. Have a great week, guys and girls.